60 plus years. It's a fight that we have never stopped fighting, and we never will. But it's also a fight that is about all of us. It is about our democracy. It is about the way in which we not only choose leaders, but we frame out the priorities we have for our communities. And there's nothing more important now when our democracy is under threat, not just our democracy as democracy in the sense of elections, but the purpose of democracy, which is to shape the issues, to shape the problems and the solutions we need to focus on. And that we're in a time when not only have we been watching a full-on attack on the constitutional right to vote, on the precious rights that we won and earned under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and all its reauthorizations, that we are seeing that as a fundamental way that happens to try to dismantle the ability of all our people to have a say in our future. And that's why it's a fight that we have not only fought regularly and generally and over our history with bipartisan support, but that is more important now because those who would want to deny us the ability to shape our policies, our problems, and our solutions do not want us all to vote. And in particular, are happy to discriminate against communities of color in voting, and even to make it harder for elderly or people with disabilities, all our communities. So I say this as we begin to enter our 60th anniversary Jubilee weekend in Selma, Alabama, marking not only and commemorating not only the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday, with John Lewis, who we will always remember and revere, that we were fighting for voting rights when we crossed that bridge, and that there's another bridge to cross. And what John Lewis reminded us is that democracy is an act. And part of the primary act of democracy right now is to ensure that we can all still participate in it. And that's why the Leadership Conference is never going away, and why you're going to hear from such a powerful, diverse, incredible, intelligent, smart, and grounded group of leaders that I'm so privileged to work with and call my colleagues. But before I do, I am so grateful and proud to be able to introduce Representative Terry Sewell, who is herself a daughter of Selma, in addition to an incredibly important leader in this fight, who has never given up the fight for voting rights and has promised that she never will. And we know it's true because we have seen her in action, including today when she reintroduced the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And with that, I also want to thank our leader, Hakeem Jeffries, and also Congressman Joe Morelli, and so many others who have stood beside all of us. But Representative Sewell, I want to turn it over to you with tremendous gratitude and pride and commitment.
Thank you so much, Maya. What an honor it is to be a part of today's press conference. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Sewell. I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I am also the proud author and lead sponsor of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the House of Representatives. And I want to thank you, Maya, and the amazing leaders who you have assembled here today. They represent a diverse coalition of activists, advocates, attorneys, and they are on the front lines of fighting for democracy. And I am eternally grateful to be a part of that fight with you all. When our voting rights come under attack, it is these extraordinary leaders who go out to bat for us in courtrooms across the nation. We will be nowhere without their partnership. So as we prepare to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, we do so at a very challenging time for our democracy. It is clear that the values that guided John Lewis and those foot soldiers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge are under attack. Every day we see new efforts to roll back our progress and to make it harder for Americans to vote. Without the protections, the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those efforts go unchecked in state legislators all across this nation. Last year alone, State officials proposed 317 bills to make it harder for Americans to cast their ballot, and almost 20 of those bills were signed into law. It is clear that extremists are hell-bent on silencing the voices of American people. 60 years may have passed since John Lewis and those foot soldiers were bludgeoned on that bridge in Selma, but we know the fight for voting rights is just as urgent today as it was then. That's why today, with the support of every House Democrat, I proudly reintroduce H.R. 14, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, in the House of Representatives. Not only would our bill restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, but it would give us the tools we need to address modern day voter suppression and ensure that every American can cast their ballot freely and fairly. This should not be a partisan issue. We know that voting rights is not a Republican issue or a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, but it's an American issue. And we need to make sure that we preserve this bedrock of our democracy, our citizenship, the right to vote for every American. While Republicans have abandoned that bipartisan tradition, this Congress provides a new opportunity for them to stand with the American people and with the values that John Lewis fought so tirelessly for to advance. Never did I think that the cause for which John Lewis and those foot soldiers who were bludgeoned on that bridge on Bloody Sunday, never did I think that their cause would become our cause too, 60 years later. But it goes to show you that progress is elusive and every generation has to fight and fight again in order to make sure that we not only preserve the progress of the past, but that we advance it. And that is what we are doing today. We're doing that by proudly reintroducing the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And we will do that this weekend when we welcome so many elected officials, activists, voting rights leaders and community leaders, and ordinary Americans from all across this nation to Selma, Alabama to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. We will once again retrace the footsteps of the marchers and pay tribute to their bravery and their heroism. But you know what? It's also an opportunity for us to rededicate ourselves to the cause for which they fought so hard for. The truth is that our commemoration isn't complete so long as we don't have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If we are to truly honor John's legacy and the legacy of those who marched, bled, and died, we must work to restore the law they fought so hard to enact. So to my colleagues in Congress, the time for action is now. And John Lewis didn't get beaten on that bridge just so that we could sit here and watch extremists erect new barriers to the ballot box. The legacy of John Lewis and those freedom fighters demands that we stand up and we do something about it. It's time for Congress to finally pass the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It's high time it's been passed, and we will continue to file it each successive Congress until it is passed, because we know that the roadmap that we follow is a roadmap that is well worn by those freedom fighters like John Lewis. They would never give up. Could you imagine if Bloody Sunday were the end of the story? No, they came back for Turnaround Tuesday, and ultimately 1 week later, they led that very famous march from Selma to Montgomery to ensure that every American has a right to vote and have access to the ballot box. It is our birthright as citizens of this great nation. And I want to thank the many stakeholders that are gathered here today to help us reintroduce the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Without your support, without your tireless advocacy, we would not be here and we would not be able to get this bill across the finish line. I know that we fight a stiff battle, both in the House and the Senate, because we can't get one Republican to sign on to it. But let us remember that it used to be very bipartisan. 5 times this bill was introduced into Congress. The reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 5 times in Congress and 3 times under Republican leadership. Most recently signed into law by George W. Bush. And it was President Bush who showed up on the 50th anniversary with President Barack Obama. And both hand in hand walked across that bridge because we all know that the right to vote is sacred. It is so important. And I want to thank all of these stakeholders for once again standing firm in our efforts to make sure that we ensure that every American have an equal access to the ballot box. Thank you so much for your leadership, Maya. Thank you all for being here. And in the words of John Lewis, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. Thanks to all the advocates gathered here today. Let's get into some good trouble.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I look forward to marching with you right across that bridge and marching into the future. So thank you. I am going to ask our next speaker to come on. Todd, you're muted.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Representative Sewell, and good afternoon, everyone. The right to vote is fundamental, and as John Lewis famously said, the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in our democracy. Yet it took almost 100 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, with the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, before Black Americans could begin to meaningfully access the right to vote in many parts of this country. Poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, threats, and intimidation were just some of the playbook that many states used to deny any meaningful access to the right to vote. Sadly, even the groundbreaking enactment of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was not itself enough to guarantee permanent eradication of the racially discriminatory barriers to vote. We've had to continue to organize, litigate, and legislate over the years to keep the Voting Rights Act a meaningful tool to combat the blight of racial discrimination in voting. And Congress has played a critical role, as we just heard, in making the promise of the Voting Rights Act real. Congress reauthorized the preclearance provisions of the Act numerous times, and also has amended the Voting Rights Act when necessary to respond to damaging Supreme Court decisions. One of those decisions, one of the most damaging of those decisions, however, is yet to be rectified. In 2013, the Supreme Court undermined the preclearance requirements of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. In doing so, the court unfortunately freed many of the states with the worst histories of discrimination to resume and even intensify their disenfranchisement of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities. Just minutes after Shelby was announced, then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott bragged on Twitter that the state's previously struck down discriminatory voter ID law should, quote unquote, go into effect immediately. And that's what happened, requiring years of litigation by LDF and other groups to finally strike down the most onerous provisions of the Texas law. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously observed in her dissent in Shelby, throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. And indeed, our communities have been drowning since Shelby in a renewed wave of voter suppression measures that have turned the clock back on voting gains. LDF can attest to that just from our own docket of voting cases that has grown ever larger since Shelby to combat the numerous ways in which states and localities are continuing to deny equal rights to vote, equal voting rights to their citizens. Just last week, LDF lawyers were back in federal court in Alabama because the state is still trying to dismantle the state's second majority Black congressional district in direct defiance of the decision we and our clients won in the Supreme Court in 2023, requiring the creation of a second Black opportunity district. Less than 3 weeks from now, we'll be back in court in the Supreme Court defending Louisiana's second majority Black congressional district that was also created only after years of litigation. The list goes on with LDF litigating cases in Texas and Georgia regarding suppression of voter suppression and racially discriminatory local redistricting plans in Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. All of this underscores the need for Congress to act immediately to undo the damage done by Shelby and other damaging decisions that have weakened Section 2 of the Act. Congress must give us the strongest possible tools to protect the Voting Rights Act of our communities, which is precisely what the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will do. For nearly 85 years, LDF has adhered to an unshakable mandate to reshape the nation for this nation for the benefit of us all, breaking down the barriers of injustice and inequality and replacing them with structures designed to uplift. So, as the 60th anniversary of the March on Selma and the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act are upon us, LDF joins with our allies here today on this call to call on Congress to honor John Lewis's legacy and enact the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, Advancement Act. Thank you. And I, by the way, have been Todd Cox. I'm the Associate Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. I'm now going to pass it to Virginia Solomon, President and CEO of Common Cause. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. And it's so good to see everyone here today. My name is Virginia K. Solomon, and I am the President and CEO of Common Cause. And on behalf of our 1.5 million members, I want to thank Congresswoman Sewell for her incredible leadership to champion the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This has been many years of work in introducing this incredible piece of legislation. It is really a joy to be here today with so many of my friends, civil rights champions, partners, and allies. We've been at this for a long time, but it's also a very sad day. It's sad for us that in the year 2025, we have to continue to fight for our rights nearly 60 years after Bloody Sunday and the march from Selma to Montgomery. It's a sad day for us when more than 20 states have passed dozens of racist laws erecting more barriers to voting than any other time since Jim Crow. It's sad when we have to keep defending our freedom to vote and fight back against discriminatory efforts that make voting more difficult for Black, Brown, disabled Americans, seniors, women, people living in rural communities, and more. And I will say there's another piece of legislation floating around Congress that would harm all of us. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that is the antidote to the oppressive and freedom-limiting proposals that the Republicans are putting forward. This is the piece of legislation we have today that can be the answer to the challenges that we're facing. It's also a very sad day when only one Republican in Congress voted to update the Voting Rights Act in recent years. That's not even right now. This is just in recent years, despite that it was reauthorized nearly unanimously less than 20 years ago. But despite everything we face and the continued schemes to silence our voices, I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful because as I travel the country and visit with Common Cause activists, supporters, and staff, I see an outpouring of support for voting rights and the freedom to vote. I remain hopeful because we see states continue to be laboratories of democracy and pass state voting rights acts because we know that it's been hard to move here at the federal level. And if John Lewis could continue to fight and persevere after everything that he endured, I remain hopeful and know that we can too, because our people power will get this across the finish line. And with leaders like Congresswoman Sewell, Congressman Morelli, Leader Jeffries, and so many others, I am hopeful and know that we can get this act over the finish line in the near future. Thank you all. I'm going to pass it now to my friend and colleague, John Yang of Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Thank you very much, Virginia, and I really appreciate your hope, your optimism in getting this done. My name is John Yang. I am the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, whose mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. Protecting the right to vote is not just a legal necessity. It is an imperative for our democracy to survive. The reality is that we stand here today because the right to vote continues to be under attack. And for many communities, especially communities of color, the barriers to the ballot box are only increasing. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is a critical safeguard for the future of our democracy, a chance to stop the reckless disregard for our fundamental right to vote. And let's be clear about what this means for the Asian American community. Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing communities in this country, but we continue to face systemic barriers to voting. Misinformation, disinformation disproportionately affect our communities. Foreign language disinformation on social media and in some ethnic media outlets creates confusion, leading many Asian Americans to be discouraged from voting, to be misled about their voting rights, and basically decide that voting is not part of their rights and part of their right to be an American. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act provides critical tools to combat those deceptive practices and voter intimidation targeted at our community. And let's also be clear about this. Racist voter suppression efforts continue to rise. We have seen voter intimidation at polling places that serve predominantly Asian American communities. We have seen racially motivated challenges to voter eligibility and efforts to limit early voting and mail-in voting, disproportionately affecting our community, knowing that our community often feel more comfortable using these types of methods and feel less intimidation because of these methods. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore federal oversight in areas of histories with racial discrimination, preventing these suppressive tactics. Language access is one of the biggest challenges that our community, the Asian American community, face. And that's been made even larger because of President Trump's latest executive order that seeks to somehow only recognize English as an official language, when our country has a rich melody of multiple languages that we have always welcomed until now. Asian Americans, based on statistics, are 30% limited English proficient. In other words, 30% of our population do not speak English fluently. But let's be clear about this. You are not less of a citizen just because you do not speak English perfectly. And your right to vote should not be diminished because English is not your natural language. Voting is not just a right, it is a responsibility that we must ensure that every voter can fulfill without barriers. Here at Advancing Justice AAJC, we are working to fill those gaps through providing translated voter materials in multiple Asian languages, through our 888 API vote hotline to support Asian Americans to vote, again provided in multiple languages, and to fight back, if necessary, through litigation against voter suppression tactics that seek to target our community. But we cannot do this alone. Congress must act to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to ensure that these protections are codified into law. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is not a partisan issue. It's a democracy issue. Every American, regardless of race, language, background, disability, should have equal access to the ballot box. We call on Congress to simply do its job and pass this legislation now. And we urge everyone that is here, that are listening to these messages, to continue to raise your voice, talk to your representatives, mobilize your communities, and ensure that no voter is left behind. Quite simply, we are demanding fairness, we are demanding justice, and we are demanding a democracy that works for all Americans. The right to vote is foundation to every other right that we fight for, and we will challenge any attempt to erode our freedom to vote. Asian Americans are part of this fight. We are not going to be invisible, we are not going to be silent, and we will not be ignored. Thank you very much. And with that, it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Damon Hewitt, the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law.
Thanks so much, John. And thank you, Congresswoman Sewell, for your leadership, and to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights for bringing us together once again. I am Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. Our organization was founded over 60 years ago at the request of President Kennedy at a time of national crisis when it came to civil rights and racial justice. During the last 60 plus years, we've worked on every civil rights issue conceivable, but with voting rights and voter protection being the cornerstone of our work. In this moment where we find ourselves today, the disconnect between what the promise of our democracy could be and the reality of what it is has become ever so stark. Just think about where we are. 60 years since John Lewis, Amelia Boynton Robinson, and other foot soldiers for justice marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to peacefully protest for the right to vote, only to be met with violence. 12 years after the U.S. Supreme Court decided its disastrous decision in Shelby County v. Holder. And 5 years since the passing of our friend, the late Congressman John Lewis. All that he fought for, all that he stood for is at risk. Rampant voter suppression is taking place across the states, as evidenced by many dozens of voter suppression bills and redistricting schemes. Redistricting itself in a righteous way that serves the interests of Black communities and other communities of color is more difficult than ever, with the Supreme Court allowing partisan gerrymandering to be elevated to an art form across parties, even masking the impacts and the effects of racial gerrymandering under the court's analysis. And voter intimidation is on the rise, as John Yang said, with racialized hate and racialized violence in general on the rise as well. Mis and disinformation are rampant. It's more difficult for people to make sense of what's happening, and there's so many bills to make it more difficult for people to vote. That's exactly what the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is designed to stop. We know the dangers that people face and the difficulty of access to the ballot box actually relates to the difficulties we're experiencing across the board right now. You know, in the education context, even the ability of students to have the freedom to learn about John Lewis's work is under attack, and educators' ability to teach about their work. Black communities are being ignored and defunded by recent federal budget cuts that are proposed and unlawful executive orders by the Trump administration. Unelected billionaires and their friends are dismantling our federal government and the protections that are supposed to provide security for us, including on the right to vote. To make the promise of democracy real, there has to be a reckoning about the current state that we're in. And that starts with figuring out where we can find freedom, where we can find voice, where we can find power, and that is at the ballot box. In a world in which our votes and our voices are being suppressed, disempowered, and attacked, it's no surprise that where we are is a long way from where we should be. You know, we've litigated at the Lawyers Committee more voting rights cases than even the Department of Justice in the last decade, about 150 cases. We work alongside so many people in this coalition and our co-leadership role in the Election Protection Coalition with the 866 I Vote hotline and other hotlines in multiple languages to address the needs of various communities. What we do is necessary, but it's insufficient. We need Congress to do its part, to give us the tools to advocate, to litigate, and frankly, to educate people on what our rights are, what our rights should be. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will do that work as a cornerstone protection. It will ensure that all Americans can exercise our right to vote, our freedom to vote, free from discrimination. It will also ensure that our voice and our voices can bring opportunity and power so that the people can determine the policies and the people who govern them and not the other way around. We stand steadfast in support of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and look forward to its passage sooner than people may think it will happen. I now want to pass it to my good friend and colleague, Melanie Campbell, a fierce advocate for justice and the leader of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you, Maya, for your leadership and convening us today. And I want to also just a shout out to Congresswoman Sewell, who is unwavering in her commitment and leadership to continue to push for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to be passed. I'm going to ditto all that has been said with my colleagues, but just thinking about where we are today, as we mentioned, many of us have mentioned the fact that the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday is coming up, and the fact that in the march that took place from Selma to Montgomery. And for me, it brings back a lot of memories of the people I was blessed to meet in my years in this work, working with the SCLC and helping to organize in 1995 a reenactment of the Selma to Montgomery March under leadership of the late Reverend James Orange. And I think about those, of course, the John Lewis, I think about Amelia Boynton, I think about Reverend Jose Williams, and so many other unsung heroes and sheroes. And so as we have this reflection moment, and as we commemorate, I'm excited to know that we're going to continue this fight for our voting rights to be protected once again. Sometimes it's darkest before the dawn, and we're in that moment. But I know that when I think about us losing Congressman Sylvester today down in Houston, who represented a former seat held by the late Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. We stand on the shoulders of those who fought before us. So it's up to our generation to continue that fight, building coalition with Leadership Conference and so many other of our civil rights and social justice organizations, those that have been around and those that are new, because it's the right thing to do. It's the American thing to do. We cannot have a solid democracy unless all of us have our really, I feel, God-given right to exercise our right to vote in this country. We built this country. We helped build this country, and we're gonna get there. And we just have to stay, keep, like Congressman would say, keep our eyes on the prize, and we're gonna get to victory. So thank you so very much. And it's my honor to now introduce Selena Stewart, who is the CEO of the League of Women Voters of the USA. Selena, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and hello, everyone. I'm Selena Stewart, CEO of the League of Women Voters of the U.S. It's such an honor to join you all on this very rainy day. As I was thinking about my remarks today, I was reminded of my interactions with Congressman Lewis. And I think back to 2011, I was a pretty newly minted attorney at that time, and we were doing a redistricting tour in Georgia. One of the first times it had been done, and he was our keynote speaker in Atlanta. And even though I didn't meet him many times, I remember getting a certificate from him, which I still have, that said, thank you for the service. And also just a quick note that he had written in the folder that the certificate came in. And so I still have it. And like I said, what stands out to me is how unflinchingly courageous and constantly kind he was. And so it's really an honor to be here. Like him and Congresswoman Sewell, this bill represents the leadership, legacy, and legislation we need in this moment. It represents hope for so many Black Americans who have been targeted by this very administration. And being here with this group of democracy fighters, it's really a wonder to me that voting as the cornerstone of democracy still requires constant defense. This bill does so many important things, but one of the things I want to mention specifically about this bill is that in every sense, it shows how checks and balances have and should work in this country. In the Shelby County versus Holder decision, the court order had dicta and direction on how to rectify what they deemed as an archaic part of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court outlined for the legislator ways to modernize this law. And that is where checks and balances really comes from, or how we see that play out. And Congressman John Lewis and Congresswoman Sewell are the epitome of what it means to have this in action. They specifically went back to redraft this to make sure that those things were taken into account. And that is how democracy is supposed to work. We cannot miss that important lesson here in this moment with the reintroduction of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or the VRAA. The VRAA is so critical, and that we need this bill now. It is so timely because of the modernizations that it makes, and specifically for the color that it gives to the Civil Rights Act in this moment in our history. So thank you so much to Congresswoman Sewell for her leadership and her tireless work on this bill. The League is so honored to support and continue to support the VRAA. And I believe that this bill is just as meaningful now than it was when it was first passed in 1965. We are still fighting, and as we channel the namesake of this bill, we must do as he said even back then, which is speak up, speak out, and get in the way, getting into good trouble, the necessary trouble. That is what this fight requires, and we call on Congress to get this done. Thank you so much, and I want to pass it over to Marlene Sallow, the Executive Director of the National Disability Rights Network.
Thank you so very much, Selena. It's a pleasure to be here today with everyone, including my fellow colleagues and civil rights champions. My name is Marlene Sallow, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Disability Rights Network. We are the nation's largest legal advocacy network that fights to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all people with disabilities across this nation. And as my colleague just indicated, this bill represents hope for all voters targeted by voter suppression tactics, which includes voters with disabilities. People with disabilities are already subjected to numerous barriers built into the electoral process that hinder their ability to vote and have their voices heard. Over 30 years after the passage of the ADA, we are still fighting for accessible polling places and ballots, problems that should have and could have been resolved. And now, in the last few years, legislative efforts across the country have been introduced in the states that will suppress the vote of multiple minority groups and disabled voters. Disabled voters that sit right at the intersection of all of these communities. Strict voter identification laws, voter purges, polling place closures, and restrictions on voter assistance, and the right to help others, have created new obstacles and intensified existing barriers to the vote for the disability community. The path to these attacks on the right to vote for people with disabilities across the country can be traced back as directly to the 2013 Shelby County and Holder decision, which was mentioned earlier. This decision struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA of 1965, which made it significantly more difficult to track and stop changes to the electoral process that would disenfranchise disabled voters. This is why the swift enactment of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is so paramount. This legislation modernizes protections once guaranteed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and is crucial to ensuring a fair and equitable democracy for all Americans. And I join my fellow colleagues here today in asking Congress to please pass this law. And now I would like to pass this over to Fred Redmond, Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO.
Well, thank you, Marlene. And I am Fred Redmond, Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, and I am proud to bring you the support of our 63 affiliated unions and 15 million members for the reintroduction of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I want to thank Representative Sewell for sponsoring this critical piece of legislation, particularly as we approach the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the historic march from Selma to Montgomery. 60 years ago this weekend, 600 people unarmed and united in their belief in democracy was brutally attacked. John Lewis was beaten within an inch of his life for a belief that every red-blooded, free-loving American should hold near and dear to their hearts, that democracy should be accessible to all American citizens. That was the promise of the Voting Rights Act when it was signed into law, but in recent years, it has been undermined by those who hold the outdated belief that democracy should be reserved only for a certain type or class of people. The labor movement is built on democracy, and we share a deep commitment with the civil rights movement to ensure the power of the vote and equal access to the vote. We know that when working families lose the right to vote, faith in our democracy erodes. And that's exactly what has happened. And now our democracy is within an inch of its life. Restoring the Voting Rights Act is how we nurse our democracy back to health. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is a critically important and common sense first step. John Lewis once said that time is of the essence to preserve the integrity and the promises of our democracy. That time is now, and we cannot allow it to deteriorate any further. And the American labor movement will not rest until the freedom, the vote, is fully restored and protected. And now it is my honor to present a fearless warrior, Sheila Katz, the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. Sheila.
Thank you, Fred. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sheila Katz, CEO of National Council of Jewish Women, a 131-year-old Jewish feminist civil rights organization advocating for all women, children, and families. It is an honor to be here alongside all of you in this sacred work to protect and expand the right to vote. In Judaism, justice is not just a value, it is an obligation. Our faith commands us to pursue justice, and our history teaches us what happens when access to democracy is denied. We know that when women, especially women of color, are stripped of their voices at the ballot box, communities suffer, rights are rolled back, and freedoms are threatened. In Hebrew, the word kol means both voice and vote, a reminder that our vote is our voice, that our votes are the tools we use to build a moral society. That's why NCJW proudly co-leads the Faithful Democracy Coalition with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice and the Interfaith Alliance, uniting diverse faith communities in the fight for what John Lewis called the sacred right to vote. We honor the courage of John Lewis and all those who risked everything for their right to vote as we gather here ahead of the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. We join here with one voice to say that this is a moment of moral urgency. The same forces that sought to silence voters in 1965 are at work today. Gerrymandering districts, enacting voter ID laws, shutting down polling places in Black and Brown communities, and rolling back hard-won progress. That is why we must act. That is why we must pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Thank you, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, for your unwavering leadership in championing this critical bill to combat modern-day voter suppression. Protecting the vote is not just a policy issue, it is a moral imperative. Our vote is our voice, and we will raise our voices together until democracy belongs to all of us. And now I am passing it to my partner in justice, Joan Neal, Interim Executive Director, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice.
Thank you, Sheila, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Joan Neal, Interim Executive Director of Network Lobby and Advocates for Catholic Social Justice, a national Catholic social justice organization founded 54 years ago in the wake of Vatican Council II and the Civil Rights Movement. It is an honor to be a part of this action on behalf of voting rights for all. On behalf of our 90,000 members across the country, we applaud Representative Sewell on her introduction of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill is a holy bill. It's needed now more than ever if we are to heal the soul of our nation. And indeed, we know that our nation needs healing right now. Catholics and people of faith believe that life is sacred and that each of us is made in the image and likeness of the Almighty. That is foundational for our religious traditions, and we believe this sacredness must be reflected in our laws and our public policies. In a democracy, the right to vote is a manifestation of human dignity, the most meaningful way to ensure that everyone's views are counted. The freedom to vote is a litmus test for the willingness of government to protect our human and civil rights. It is foundational to and a hallmark of a functioning democracy. Therefore, we must call out any and all efforts to suppress the vote, particularly in communities that have long suffered from voter suppression and disenfranchisement. We know opponents of freedom are working hard to resist access to the ballot because they fear they will lose the power that is conferred upon them historically by white supremacy, a power that has been used to advantage some at the expense of others. Only in a healthy democracy will we have the capacity as a nation to address the many ills our faiths call us to heal: systemic racism, poverty, gun violence, and more. Until voting rights are fully protected, our democracy remains at risk. Therefore, Congress must pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act now. We at Network stand ready and willing to use our power to make this a reality. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Sakira Cook, Federal Policy Director at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Sakira.
Thank you, Joan. Hi, everyone. My name is Sakira Cook. I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Southern Poverty Law Center, founded in 1971 to carry forward the work of the Civil Rights Movement in the Deep South and beyond. 60 years ago this week, a group of ordinary Americans crossed a bridge in Selma. In doing so, they built a new one, a bridge to an America where the right to vote is guaranteed for all, an America where everyone has a hand in shaping our future. Today, that America is not just slipping away, It's being actively torn down. We can't just remember those marchers. We are now called to carry their work forward, not just to protect the freedoms they bled for, but to expand them. At SPLC, we've been on the front lines of this fight. Since Shelby, we've watched a wave of anti-voter laws sweep across the South. From Alabama to Georgia, we've seen laws that restrict absentee voting, purge eligible voters, redraw districts to dilute the power of Black and Brown communities, and even criminalize people for giving water to those waiting in long lines. And just last week, a Florida legislator introduced a bill to make it harder for students to vote by eliminating student IDs as a valid identification. These laws all have one thing in common. They seek to strip away the freedom to vote and block people, especially Black and Brown people, from having a voice in the decisions that shape their lives and their future. SPLC has challenged these laws and others in the court. We fought at the state level for protections, planting the seeds for change with the Florida and Alabama Voting Rights Acts. But the truth is, just as in 1965, only federal action can ensure every American's right to vote, no matter where they live. That's why we're standing with Representative Sewell and this coalition to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, not just to restore the Voting Rights Act, but to strengthen and modernize it for the 21st century. Some might ask, why bring this bill forward now, when the odds seem so steep? The answer is simple. We're at a defining moment in our democracy, one where the very idea of government, by and for the people, is being tested. We have a choice. We can stand up for a country where leaders answer to the people, or one where power is hoarded by an elite few, pushing the voices of everyday Americans to the side. It's through the ballot box that we hold our leaders accountable and ensure our voices are heard. This bill isn't about partisanship. It's about making sure we have a country where all people have the power to shape our future. I'll close by saying this. This fight is deeply personal to me. My grandmother recently turned 95 and was born in rural Georgia in 1930. For a large part of her life, she experienced state-sponsored discrimination and didn't always have a say in who represented her. I think about her often because she's a living reminder that the freedom we cherish today aren't guaranteed. They are sustained only if we work to protect them. So today, let's continue the work of crossing the bridge to make this democracy work for everyone. Let's pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act into law, ensuring that the freedom to vote is protected for every American in every community for generations to come. And now I will pass it to my colleague, Jaleesa Lyles, campaign coordinator at the Declaration for American Democracy.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jaleesa Giles, campaign coordinator for the Declaration for American Democracy, which is a coalition of over 260 organizations across various issue areas, all fighting to protect and strengthen our democracy. Today, we are proud to support the reintroduction of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a critical step to restoring voting rights protections gutted by Shelby County versus Holder. For too long, communities of color have faced targeted voter suppression, and this bill will help stop those attacks before they happen. In addition to this critical protection for our sacred freedom to vote, we are continuing the fight to expand access to all and remove barriers to voting. Affectionately referred to as the Shield and Sword, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, paired with DC statehood and the Native American Voting Rights Act, will ensure that all of us can access the ballot box and have our voices heard. Unfortunately, there are bad faith efforts like the SAVE Act and ACE Act continuously attempting to spread misinformation and create unnecessary barriers to voting. These bills are a distraction from the real threats to our democracy. So instead, Congress should focus on critical solutions such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and ensure that all of us can have a say in the decisions that impact our lives and communities. We know that today isn't the finish line and tomorrow might not be either. We may not win this fight overnight, but that has never stopped us before. The struggle for voting rights didn't end in 1965, and it doesn't end today. So we will continue to push and keep organizing and to keep demanding action because our democracy and future depend on it. So today we encourage Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to our friends at ACLU.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and deep thanks to Congresswoman Sewell, to the Leadership Conference, and to all our partners and friends here today. My name is Adriel Cepeda-Derriex, and I am Deputy Director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project. The ACLU may be older, but our project was born in 1965. We're as old as the Selma March and the VRAA. And since then, our mission has been to build and defend an inclusive democracy free from racial discrimination. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act carries the name of a man who stood for all of those principles, someone who bled for the right to vote. We've heard about it today, but it bears repeating. This year marks 60 years since Congressman Lewis and hundreds of other soldiers for democracy marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where they were met with clubs, with tear gas, with police dogs, just for demanding their fundamental right to vote. But their courage led directly to the Voting Rights Act, which has been a shield against racial discrimination at the ballot box, and which the ACLU has used to litigate cases on behalf of brave clients in Alabama and Louisiana, all the way to the Supreme Court in just the past couple of years. But the courts have wrongly chipped away at that shield, as we know, and that's only emboldened the voter suppression that now sweeps our country. So we know now that there's today even more to be vigilant about when it comes to safeguarding our voting rights. As Jaleesa just explained, we and other partners here have been monitoring the federal SAVE Act. It is a dangerous piece of legislation that would put up more needless barriers to voting. If it is introduced, we urge Congress to reject it. But we are proud to join our many partners in the struggle here today because the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would let Congress do what the Constitution says it has to do, protect citizens from racial discrimination in voting. The ballot is not an allowance, it is a right. And the fight for that right began long ago. It carried Congressman Lewis, Dr. King, and martyrs like James Reeb over that bridge in Selma. And we're here with you to make our voices heard because Congress must pass this law, not just because the fight is far, far from over, but because it is now our turn to make sure it goes on. Thank you very much. And now I'll pass it back to our wonderful hosts at the Leadership Conference.
Thank you so much, Adriel, and to every single one of our leaders who has spoken. It was powerful, it's the truth, and it's exactly why we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Advancement Act. We want to open it up to questions and see if there's anything that we can address.
Thank you, Maya, and I will be reading any questions that we get from press, but I don't see any at the moment.
All right, well, with that, we are available. This incredible group of leaders and organizations is available as we march forward for our voting rights for every single person and community in this country. And we thank you for participating. We thank this incredibly august group of leaders, and we look forward to being in conversation with you in the future. Take good care and be safe and well.